Thank you. Thank you first to Left Bank for having me. It's obviously a great bookstore, and I spent a lot of time at Left Bank when I lived here. So thank you very much for hosting this event. I also want to just thank, first and foremost, my colleagues from the Post-Dispatch who are here and who are my friends and have supported me for a long time when I wrote this book, for the 6 years that I wrote this book, and for the last 2 weeks since its publication. So appropriately, because they're journalists, they're all in the back drinking, but thank you guys. And thank you also to the sort of celebrity in the audience. This is a book about Henry Gerecke, chaplain Henry Gerecke, and his son, Colonel Hank Gerecke, came up from Cape Girardeau to be here tonight. He's in the front, and I hope he's going to say a few words in a little bit. Hank was my collaborator in every way on this book. I spent a lot of time at his kitchen table with he and his wife Millie, learning about his father and his mother and their upbringing in St. Louis. So for those two reasons, this is a very meaningful and special night for me. So thank you both, collectively and individually. Okay. We're good. So Friday, June 14th, 1946 was day 155 of the trial of the major war criminals, more commonly now referred to simply as the Nuremberg Trials. Though no one in courtroom 600 in Nuremberg's Palace of Justice knew it yet, the trial was about halfway over. On day 155, Franz von Papen, Hitler's former chancellor, was on the witness stand. As he testified, the Third Reich's radio propaganda chief, Hans Fritzsche, a sub-lieutenant of Joseph Goebbels, wrote a letter which Baldur von Schirach, the former leader of the Hitler Youth Movement, then translated into English. It was addressed to Mrs. Alma Gerecke of 3204 Halliday Avenue in South St. Louis. Holding Nazi leaders accountable for World War II was an experiment. At the time, there was no legal precedent for framing criminal charges against the perpetrators of a war of aggression. As early as 1944, Allied leaders were hashing out the best way to punish people whose criminal activities were so horrendous that laws barring them didn't technically exist. Nuremberg was an improvisation. Never before had the international community held a state's major leaders accused and convicted them of conspiring to commit crimes against humanity. The trial of the major war criminals was, in the words of one of its American prosecutors, quote, a benchmark in international law and the lodestar of thought and debate on the great moral and legal questions of war and peace, end quote. Existing within the larger Nuremberg improvisation was another that has never been told in full. It is a historical asterisk to what was called the trial of the century. It was an experiment in how good confronts radical evil. And at its center was a farm kid from Missouri. Those organizing the Nuremberg trials knew that if they were going to try some of the world's most notorious criminals for war crimes, they also had to follow the Geneva Conventions. Article 16 of the Convention's regulations regards the treatment of prisoners of war and states that prisoners of war are permitted, quote, complete freedom in the performance of their religious duties, including attendance at the services of their faith. Ministers of religion who are prisoners of war, whatever may be their denomination, shall be allowed freely to minister to their co-religionists. But Nuremberg was not the average POW camp. The world was watching as Hitler's deputies answered for the Holocaust. The Allies didn't trust Wehrmacht chaplains to do the job, so they brought in two of their own instead. Chaplain Henry Gerecke of St. Louis and Chaplain Sixtus O'Connor of Oxford, New York. For the first time in history, U.S. Army chaplains would minister to the enemy. And the enemy included some of the 20th century's most infamous names. Hermann Göring, Hitler's number 2, commander of Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and the force behind the Third Reich's final solution. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and the Reich's armaments minister, who took advantage of concentration camp labor in places like Mauthausen to mine granite used in Germany's grand building plans. General Wilhelm Keitel, field marshal and second only to Hitler in Germany's military hierarchy. Fritz Sauckel, the Reich's labor minister in charge of what one historian has called, quote, the greatest slave roundup in history, end quote, which included, by the end of 1942, 4.5 million foreign workers. And Hans Frank, Hitler's personal lawyer and eventually the Governor General of Poland, where he earned nicknames such as Slayer of the Poles and the Butcher of Krakow. On that Friday in June 1946, von Papen testified in courtroom 600. Fritzsche wrote the letter to Alma Gerecke. When he finished, all 21 of the Nazi prisoners, including the Catholics and those who had refused any spiritual counsel, signed it. It read in part, "Your husband, Pastor Gerecke, has been taking religious care of the undersigned defendants during the Nuremberg trial. He has been doing so for more than half a year. We now have heard, dear Mrs. Gerecke, that you wish to see him back home after his absence of several years. Because we also have wives and children, we understand this wish of yours very well. Our dear Chaplain Gerecke is necessary for us, not only as a minister, but also as the thoroughly good man that he is. Surely we need not describe him as such to his own wife. We simply have come to love him." In the fall of 2007, I was writing a story for the newspaper right down the street, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where I covered the religion beat. The story was about Operation Barnabas, a program that the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod had recently begun to help chaplains who were returning from Iraq and Afghanistan more smoothly re-enter their congregations back home. But I needed some color for the story. So I went to Concordia Seminary in Clayton. The school's historical institute happened to have an exhibition on the history of the American military chaplaincy at the time. Under one of those pieces of glass was a letter to Alma Gerecke from the Nazis. I read that word love just above the signatures of the perpetrators of a genocide, and I thought, that could be a story. I found Gerecke's eldest son, Hank Gerecke, in Cape Girardeau, and I sat at his kitchen table and he told me the story of his father and mother. And 6 years later, here we are. Hank and his younger brother, Corky, were already in uniform in 1943 when their father raised his hand and said he'd like to be a war chaplain. The first part of Gerecke's career had been spent pastoring a church in South St. Louis. Then, during the Depression, he had been a missioner with the St. Louis Lutheran City Mission, traveling the broken city and ministering to those on the streets, in hospitals, and in city jails. Now he wanted to do his part for the war effort. He was 50 years old. The Army assigned Gerecke to the 98th General Hospital, which in 1944 landed in Hermitage, about 60 miles west of London, in the south of England. There, the 98th set up a 1,000-plus bed transit hospital where doctors and nurses would literally just stop the bleeding